There's an old story out of the Smoky Mountains, told first by settlers who wandered too far into the high hollows in the early 1800s, before cabins dotted every ridge and before roads carved the mountains into counties. They said the Cherokee people who lived high in the snow country built huts that the mountains themselves respected. Storms tore through the valleys, avalanches thundered down ravines, yet the Cherokee lodges stood untouched, as if the earth had chosen to spare them. Most settlers didn't believe it at first. They had come from the lowlands, from the worn farmlands of Virginia and the Carolinas, dragging wagons and iron stoves and English tools. To them, a house meant squared logs, a chimney of stone, and a roof pitched against the rain. But when they climbed high enough past the last stand of oak, where the spruce began and the deer trails thinned, they found something altogether different. In the winter of 1804, a small group of frontier families, among them a man named Eli Danner, settled along the Little Pigeon River near what would one day be Gatlinburg. Danner was a tough sort, born of Scots-Irish stock, and he believed no people could outwork him. He had cleared timber for weeks before the first snow came, raising a cabin of green logs notched tight with a shake roof he'd cut from chestnut. When the first storm hit, it came down heavy 2 feet overnight, then 3 more before sunrise. Danner's cabin groaned and leaked. By the second night, a drift of snow broke through the shakes, scattering cold powder over his sleeping children. He cursed and patched, but by the third storm, the roof buckled. That's when he saw smoke rising from across the ridge. He followed it through the snow, half expecting to find another settler, but instead he came to a circle of small, low huts, Cherokee winter lodges. They seemed half buried, their roofs sloped so low they nearly kissed the earth. Snow lay thick upon them, yet they did not collapse. It was as if they were part of the mountain itself. A man named Tsali, older, his hair streaked with gray, stood outside, feeding a fire pit lined with stones. He greeted Danner not with surprise but with a nod, as if he'd been expecting him. "You build house against the mountain," Tsali said through a translator, later recorded by missionary accounts. "We build with it." The settlers learned that the Cherokee huts weren't huts at all in the English sense. They were asai, or winter houses, semi-subterranean lodges, used for centuries by tribes from the southern Appalachians to the upper Missouri. Archaeologists today still find their remains. Circular depressions lined with river clay, walls woven from saplings, roofs framed in oak and covered with bark, earth, and sod. The design was ancient, practical, and ingenious. The base dug into the hillside served as insulation, cool in summer, warm in winter. The low roof profile deflected wind, and the earth covering absorbed sound and shock, even from slides or falling snow. The fire pit sat in the center, vented through a smoke hole. In My Life as an Indian, James Willard Schultz described the same principle among the Blackfeet of Montana a generation later. But the Cherokee had perfected it for the Appalachian climate. Modern studies from the Museum of the Mountain Man and the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal confirm how these lodges survived weather events that splintered timber cabins. To a frontier mind like Danner's, the concept was revelation. "It looked more like a burrow than a house," he wrote years later, in a family account preserved in local archives, "but it kept them warm when my own roof near buried us." By February, the snowpack along the slopes above the Pigeon River grew heavy enough to groan under its own weight. One afternoon, as Danner and his oldest boy tried to clear the cabin roof, the slope above gave way. A wall of snow roared down, taking trees and brush with it. The Danners barely escaped through the rear wall. When they dug their way out, their home was gone, logs shattered, hearthstones buried under 10 feet of packed snow. But when they climbed to Tsali's village, every Aussie still stood. The snow had flowed around them, not over. Their roofs, being rounded and close to the ground, let the Avalanches' force pass over like water around a rock. In later years, scholars from the National Park Service studying indigenous architecture noted this precise survival trait. The semi-buried dwellings distributed pressure laterally through the packed earth walls, while settler cabins with their vertical log walls and heavy beams absorbed the impact head-on. For Danner and his people, this wasn't theory. It was survival learned by humility. When spring came and the thaw split open the drifts, he rebuilt his home, only this time he built it half into the ground. He laid saplings in a dome, packed the roof with bark, moss, and earth. His neighbors mocked him at first, calling it Danner's Mole Hill. But when the next winter came and snow slid harmlessly past his rounded roof, they started digging too. Stories like Danner's spread across the early frontier. By the 1832, when men like Jedediah Smith and Kit Carson crossed the Rockies, they would remember tales of native architecture that blended with the land instead of standing against it. Smith's own journals mention the domed huts of the tribes east of the Great Plains as examples of natural engineering. Even Charles Larpenteur, the fur trader who spent 40 years along the upper Missouri, wrote admiringly of earth lodges used by the Mandan and Arikara kin in spirit to the Cherokee Asi. No wind could uproot them, no snow could crush them, he said. Modern architects and anthropologists studying indigenous resilience have found that many of these structures prefigured sustainable design by centuries. They required no nails, no cut, lumber, no imported tools, only a deep understanding of how earth, snow, and timber work together. The Appalachian settlers, for all their pride and pluck, had to learn that lesson the hard way. And many did. To this day, if you hike high enough in the Smokies above the tourist paths and into the spruce-shadowed hollows, you might still find a mound of stone and clay shaped like half a dome, long reclaimed by moss and root. The locals call them Indian huts, though the Cherokee word Asi means something far older, a place not built against the mountain, but born from it. By the time the snow melted from the ridges of the Smokies, word of the snow huts had drifted through every frontier cabin in the valley. Settlers whispered about a Cherokee man who could read the mountain like scripture, knew where the slides would fall before the clouds even gathered. His name, as best they could say it, was Sali of Nundayehi, a craftsman, a builder, and in the Cherokee tongue, a man who understood the breath of the land. Among his people, Sali wasn't called an engineer, though that's what he was in every sense the modern world would recognize. He had learned by 1,000 winters, watching how storms rolled down from the high gaps and how the snow chose its path. To him, a hillside wasn't just ground, it was memory. Each scar of rock, each cluster of spruce told where the mountain would break and where it would hold. When the settlers came and began chopping flat spots for cabins, Sali had warned them through interpreters sent by Moravian traders. "Don't build there," he'd said of the north slopes. "That hill sheds its skin when the snow grows heavy." But settlers were stubborn, and the warning of one Cherokee man sounded to them like superstition. It took one terrible winter and one lost cabin to prove him right. In the spring of 1805, after Eli Danner's cabin was lost to the Avalanche, Sali invited the settlers to watch him rebuild a lodge for one of his kin whose own ASI had collapsed from age. He chose a south-facing slope, a place where the sun could warm the snowpack and where the prevailing wind blew away drifts before they grew too deep. The floor plan began not with timber, but with the soil itself. He marked a circle 10 feet across, then dug down to the hardpan, a method Danner later noted in his journal as earth founding. From there, Sali and his sons bent green saplings into arcs, crossing them overhead to make a dome. Each bend was lashed with hickory bark and tightened with sinew. The skeleton rose slowly, humming under tension like a drawn bow. Then came the layering, bark, woven grass, and finally thick mats of sod. When he was done, it looked not like a cabin, but a hillock, something grown, not built. Danner marveled. "He made a roof you could walk upon," he wrote. "The earth itself was the shingles. The door faced east, toward the sunrise, a habit older than memory." Sali said, "Because warmth and light should always greet a home." Inside, the fire pit sat below ground level, its smoke hole shaped like a funnel through the roof. The air inside never grew thick. "See?" Sali said through the trader, pressing his palm to the packed earth wall. "The snow will sit here, not crush here, like water around a stone." What Sali explained in the language of respect, modern geologists and ethnographers would later translate into the language of physics. The Cherokee ASI worked because it distributed load and temperature evenly. The curved form shed weight laterally. The semi-subterranean base kept internal temperatures near 40 degrees even when the air outside froze solid. Studies from the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal and the National Park Service note that such indigenous architecture predates any European-style log home on the continent by centuries. These weren't improvised huts. They were the product of generations of refinement in the most unforgiving terrain east of the Mississippi. The settlers didn't call it engineering, they called it Indian magic. But slowly, some began to build in the same way. By 1806, a handful of frontier families along the Little Pigeon and the French Broad had started blending their square cabin walls with rounded, sod-covered roofs. They built smoke pits instead of chimneys. They banked their cabins into the hillsides. The result was crude, but it worked. The snow rolled off instead of piling on. The wind whistled overhead, not through the cracks. And when next winter came, no cabins collapsed. The first white man to truly understand Solly's craft was not a trapper or farmer, it was a missionary. Reverend John Daniel Asbury, a circuit preacher from the Carolinas, had come into the mountains to bring the gospel to the frontier. But what he found was a people whose wisdom seemed carved straight out of the hills. Asbury wrote in his journal, now housed in the National Frontier Trails Museum, "The Cherokee live in communion with the mountain. They listen to its warnings and build with its counsel. If they be heathen, they are heathen in harmony with creation." He stayed that winter in one of Talley's lodges. He recorded the temperatures inside versus out, nearly 40 degrees warmer, without a single cut of firewood, more than what a small pit required. That spring he wrote to colleagues in Knoxville, recommending that the settlers might learn from the Indians' prudence before the Lord teaches it by ruin. It was an uncommon humility for a man of his age, but history has a habit of punishing wisdom when it comes from the wrong tongue. By the 1832, the same Cherokee nation that had built homes to survive the worst the mountains could offer would face something far crueler, the forced removals under the Indian Removal Act. Solly himself, now an old man, refused to leave. He led his family into the same high hollows where he had once taught Danner to build. They hid there, surviving off corn and roots, their ASI camouflaged beneath layers of moss and snow. For months, the soldiers couldn't find them. Their survival huts, meant to protect from avalanches, now protected them from the government's wrath. When he was finally captured in 1838, Solly's story turned legend. According to oral tradition preserved by the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, he offered his life so his people could stay. He was executed near the Tuckasegee River. The survivors fled deeper into the Smokies, where their descendants live to this day. Among them, the word Asi remains a quiet reminder, a home that endures by yielding, a shelter built in humility, not conquest. When the mountain men came west, men like Jim Bridger, Jedediah Smith, and James Beckworth, they brought with them lessons whispered from the old frontier. Many had heard tales of the Cherokee huts that bent but never broke. In the Rockies, they would see the same wisdom, echoed by the Crow, the Mandan, the Blackfeet, each tribe building shelters molded to their landscapes. Bridger once remarked, recorded in Hoffin's Mountain Men and the Fur Trade of the Far West, that the red man makes no war with the wind. He lets it pass by. When settlers in Colorado and Wyoming built their first sod houses, some old-timers claimed the idea came not from the plains themselves, but from those Appalachian Cherokee huts, half remembered through stories like Danner's. Today, historians trace a line thin but certain from those early ASI lodges to the sod homes of the Great Plains, to the earth-bermed cabins of modern sustainability design. Every one of them carries the same truth. The mountain will always win. The wise build, knowing that, and in doing so, they endure. By the time the first wagons rolled west through the Cumberland Gap, a quiet exchange had already taken place between two worlds. The settlers had come to teach religion, language, law, but the mountains had their own tutors. In the dark spruce hollows and frozen ridges of the Appalachians, they had learned lessons that would follow them farther than they ever imagined. Those lessons came not from books or sermons, but from the people who had lived on that land long before the word frontier ever existed. The Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Creek, all had mastered the art of living where the weather itself was a predator. When the Great Migration began in earnest, those who'd survived the Smokies carried something unseen in their wagons, the memory of how to build with the land, not against it. And they would need it again because ahead lay a continent of avalanche country. In 1824, trappers of the Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a young outfit bankrolled by William Henry Ashley and fronted by Jedediah Smith, made their way into the Wind River Range. The men were as hard as tanned leather and twice as stubborn. They'd come to gather beaver pelts, but by late winter they were gathering graves. Smith's own journal entries, later recovered and published in the Journal of Jedediah S. Smith, 1800, and 1832, tell of storms that lasted weeks, of snowslides that buried entire camps. On the third night, he wrote, "We heard the mountain groan and break loose above our shelter. The snow fell as if the whole heaven had collapsed. Those who built their lean-tos against bare slopes were lost. But one camp, led by an older French trapper named Etienne Provost, who had traded long enough with the Crow to learn their wintercraft, survived untouched. Their shelters were half-dug, low domes reinforced with saplings and sod nearly identical to the Cherokee Asi. When the avalanche roared, it passed over them like wind over stone." Jedediah Smith noted the design, sketching a small dome in the margin of his journal. "The natives build as though they know the mind of the snow," he wrote. He wasn't wrong. Farther north, the Crow nation, with whom James Beckwourth would later live and fight, built their winter lodges with the same curved principles. Beckwourth, whose adventures were recorded in 1856, described them as earth huts that no storm could batter down. He'd seen mountain men lose tents and cabins alike to wind that howled like wolves, while the Crow lodges stood serene. Beckwourth's biographer later wrote that his years among the Crow taught him the patience of snow and the prudence of timber, the same patience Solly had practiced 1,000 miles east. Historians from the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal note this cross-pollination of survival methods across tribes and frontiersmen. Whether in the Wind Rivers or the Bitterroots, the same lesson held. To survive, you must bow before the mountain. By the late 1822, the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous had become a yearly gathering for trappers, traders, and the curious breed of men historians now call the mountain men. Their tales flowed thicker than whiskey. Charles Larpenteur, who chronicled 40 years of fur trade life, wrote that some camps built low huts of earth, round like the Indians, for better shelter in deep winter. They called them mud lodges, not realizing they were repeating an architecture older than the Bible. When the snowmelt came, they tore them down and moved on, never knowing they had borrowed genius. At the 1832 rendezvous on the Green River, Jim Bridger, barely 28, already a legend, was said to have told younger trappers that the red men build smarter than we think. Their huts bend, ours break. The story is recorded in Winblevin's Give Your Heart to the Hawks, drawn from first-hand trader accounts. And yet, for all their respect, few trappers admitted it openly. Pride was a thick hide, and it took more than a blizzard to pierce it. That pride met its reckoning in the winter of 1833. Near the headwaters of the Snake River, a trapping party under Joseph Meek, a Virginian-turned-mountain man, built their cabins high on a northern slope, just below timberline. Meek had heard of Crow huts, but he wanted nothing to do with what he called burrowing like rabbits. The snow began early, heavy and wet. For weeks the sky stayed white, the wind screaming through the pines. On January 10th, the mountains moved. Witnesses in later accounts compiled by Leroy Hafen wrote of a slide that tore the forest clean to stone. Meek's cabin was splintered in a heartbeat. Of the 12 men inside, only 4 survived. A half-mile downslope, a group of Shoshone hunters who had built rounded snow lodges in a shallow basin survived untouched. Their domes, packed with snow and brush, had flexed under pressure, absorbing shock instead of fighting it. When rescuers found them days later, Meek himself reportedly said, "The white man builds for comfort, the Indian builds for forever." By the time wagon trails opened through South Pass, stories of the Indian snow houses had become part of the frontier's quiet folklore. Guides who had once laughed at them now taught emigrants to cut into the earth, to lower their roofs, to let the land carry the weight. The National Park Service's Fur Trade and Exploration Archives record dozens of emigrant journals noting earth shelters built in the mountain crossings, many attributed to old trappers who had learned from the tribes. Even in California's Sierra Nevada, where snow could bury trees, settlers began shaping their cabins closer to the ground, learning to anchor to bedrock instead of clearing it. By the 1842, what began as Cherokee mountain craft had evolved into a pan-frontier wisdom, adopted, forgotten, and rediscovered with every new ridge. Modern scholars like Bernard DeVoto and Dale Morgan have called the fur trade the greatest transfer of practical knowledge between two civilizations on this continent. The mountain men learned how to tan hides, cure meat, find water, and most importantly, how to build shelter that could endure the untamed world. But those lessons rarely made the history books. The architecture of survival left no monuments, only mounds of earth reclaimed by moss and time. Yet, in museum exhibits from Pinedale, Wyoming, to Independence, Missouri, you'll find models of those early lodges, low, round, and humble. The plaques may call them indigenous dwellings, but the truth is richer. These were the prototypes of endurance, the first sustainable homes of the American frontier. The settlers who once sneered at them eventually built their own versions, half-dugouts on the plains, sod houses in Nebraska, turf huts in the Dakotas. Every one bore the same design DNA that had saved Eli Danner in the Smokies and Provost in the Wind Rivers. The mountain, it turned out, didn't care about culture or race. It spared only those who listened. Today, architects studying bioclimatic design cite those same principles: thermal mass, aerodynamic form, load distribution. What Solly and his kin knew by heart, modern engineers write in formulas. Yet the story isn't only about physics, it's about humility. The kind that lets a man look at a mountain and admit, "You are older than I am, teach me." The frontier men who learned that survived. The ones who didn't became the bones beneath the slides. And somewhere high in the Smoky Mountains, where moss covers the remains of old AC, the lesson still waits in silence. In every generation, there are those who build loudly and those who build quietly. The settlers who came west built loud. They cut down trees with the echo of axes, split stone for chimneys, hammered nails until the sound carried for miles. But the first architects of the mountains, the native builders, worked in silence. They didn't conquer the land, they studied it. They read the slope of every hill, the sound of every wind. Their houses were not statements, but questions, each one asking the earth, "How do I belong here?" Among all the frontiersmen who learned from them, few ever grasped that philosophy as deeply as Jedediah Smith. By 1826, Smith had traveled farther west than any white man alive. From the Dakotas to California, across deserts and mountains, he'd seen every way a man could die. Yet what impressed him most, according to his own journals, wasn't the power of nature, it was how certain tribes could live inside it without fear. In one entry from his 1831 journal, Smith described a lodge of the Utahs, half in the ground and half out, roofed in bark and sod. Within, the air was warm as midsummer, the smoke clear, and the people content. Smith's own men, meanwhile, shivered in their tents. He had seen the same principle among the Cherokee in his youth when he passed through Tennessee on his first western march. He wrote, "Their huts are low and strange to our eyes, but they outlast the tempests. It is their quiet that saves them." That quiet, what Smith called the stillness of the earth, was more than poetic language. It was physics before physics had a name on the frontier. Modern researchers at the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal and the National Park Service's Fur Trade Archives have studied the design of these lodges in remarkable detail. What they found confirms what mountain men learned only by hard living. The Asai of the Cherokee, like the earth lodges of the Mandan and Crow, worked on a principle engineers now call thermal inertia. The packed soil and sod stored heat from the fire pit, releasing it slowly over hours. Even when the fire went out, the temperature inside changed little. Where a log cabin leaked warmth through its gaps, the ASI sealed it within living earth. It breathed just enough through its smoke vent to clear air, but never enough to waste heat. James Willard Schultz wrote of a similar lodge among the Blackfeet. The snow lay over us 6 feet deep, and yet inside we sat in shirt sleeves, the fire faint and low, the air sweet and warm. The secret wasn't in the fire, it was in the shape. Round walls, no corners. The old trappers used to say corners breed cold, and they were right. Heat circulates more evenly in a dome, and pressure distributes in all directions. That's why no avalanche ever crushed an ASI. It was a structure that yielded, not resisted. There was a man named Ephraim Bowen, a trapper and later a guide for John C. Fremont's expeditions, who'd spent years living among the Osage and learned to build what he called earth hollers. In a letter preserved in the American Mountain Men Association archives, Bowen wrote, "The Indian's way of building is not to fight the weather, but to lay under it like a stone under a stream. The water flows, the stone remains," he told Fremont once. "Your maps can't show where the cold moves, sir. You've got to feel it." Bowen was no scholar, but he was right. The science of survival in the early frontier was more observation than calculation. He'd mark where the frost gathered first, where snow melted last, and where the trees bent in the wind. That's where he'd build, not on the proud ridge, but in the quiet hollow. The Cherokee, the Crow, the Blackfeet, they already knew these signs. Their architecture was not invention, it was listening made visible. In the 19th century, Eastern newspapers often painted native structures as primitive huts, while romanticizing the log cabins of the settlers as emblems of progress. Yet, when winter records were compared, it was the so-called primitive dwellings that proved superior. In 1837, a missionary in North Carolina named Reverend Samuel Worcester recorded that Cherokee ASI homes required 1/3 less wood to heat than settler cabins of similar size. He marveled that their interiors rarely smoked, thanks to the low pressure created by the dome's air circulation. It wasn't just efficient, it was ecological. No nails, no saws, no deforestation. Each hut could be returned to the earth within a single season without leaving a scar. Modern architects studying vernacular sustainability often cite these lodges as early examples of passive heating and pressure distribution. What they rarely mention is the price paid by those who built them. By the time such wisdom reached the academic world, most of its keepers had been driven from their lands. In 1838, when the U.S. Army forced the Cherokee on the Trail of Tears, the old huts of the Smokies were left behind, silent as graves. Settlers took their clay, their bark, their timber. Some even used the old foundations to build their own homes. One of those settlers, a man named Andrew McCrary, left behind a note in his family Bible, now archived in the Museum of the Mountain Man. "I built on the same ground where the Indians lived. The frost does not come up through the floor, as it does in the cabin on the ridge. Their way is better." He didn't know it, but his floor sat over the buried remains of an ASI that had survived more winters than his family ever would. Every thaw, the mountain exhaled a bit of steam through the earth where the old fire pit lay. Locals said it was the breath of the land, proof that the Cherokee spirit still warmed those who listened. Maybe they were right. In the 20th century, archaeologists excavating Cherokee sites in western North Carolina found remains of ASI that dated back over 500 years. Soil samples showed layers of ash and clay hardened by repeated heating cycles, a prehistoric example of heat-treated insulation. Researchers from the University of Tennessee tested reconstructed lodges in controlled studies. The results stunned them. A constant interior temperature of 45–55 degrees Fahrenheit without fire, and up to 75 degrees Fahrenheit with only a small one. Snow and wind increased the stability instead of threatening. It was, by every measure, a masterpiece of environmental engineering. Yet the Cherokee builders who perfected it had no blueprints, no equations, only centuries of accumulated trial and observation. They were, in every sense, engineers of silence. In today's West, you'll find echoes of their work everywhere. the sod-roofed homesteads of Wyoming, the dugouts of Kansas, the energy-efficient earth homes built by modern architects. Each borrows something from the logic first practiced in those Smoky Mountain hollows. Even the National Frontier Trails Museum notes in its exhibits that the mountain man's lodge was often closer in design to native dwellings than to the log cabins of the East. It's a quiet admission one history took 2 centuries to make. For all our machines, our measurements, our concrete and steel, the truth remains unchanged. The most enduring structures on this continent were made of patience, humility, and earth. An old Cherokee proverb says, "Listen to the wind, it talks. Listen to the silence, it speaks." The builders of silence, the ones who raised homes that could stand beneath avalanches, heard that voice and obeyed it. The settlers who survived, the mountain men who lived to tell, carried fragments of that wisdom westward. From the Smokies to the Tetons, the lesson remained the same. The earth will always teach those who kneel to learn. And in the quiet hollows where the snow still drifts deep and the moss covers what was once a roof, the breath of those builders lingers steady, warm, and unbroken. By the mid-1840s, the fur trade was dying. Beaver hats had gone out of fashion in the East, and the great rendezvous were growing smaller each year. But even as commerce faded, knowledge was being traded still, not in silver or pelts, but in ideas. The last of the true mountain men were no longer just trappers. They were engineers of survival men who had studied the wilderness like Scripture and who understood that the difference between living and dying in the high country often came down to one thing: how a man kept his fire. And so, in the long twilight of the frontier, the mountain men began perfecting what the Cherokee, Crow, and Mandan had known for centuries, that warmth came not from conquering the cold, but from learning to store the heat of the earth itself. In the winter of 1845, Jim Bridger and 2 greenhorns found themselves snowbound near South Pass. The men's cabin, built hastily from pine, leaked smoke and heat like a sieve. Bridger had been there before he knew better. "Dig low," he told them. "The wind can't rob what the mountain hides." So they carved into a south-facing slope, cutting through frozen dirt with old shovels and elk antlers. It was miserable work, but when they set the fire in the center pit that night, something miraculous happened. The smoke rose slowly, then curled out through a vent Bridger had cut into the roof of sod. The walls glowed warm as baked clay. Snow fell silently above, sealing the roof tight. The next morning, one of the greenhorns, a man from Street Louis named Packer, stuck his head outside and gasped. His beard froze instantly. Inside, though, it was near 50 degrees. That winter, Bridger's men learned something no book would ever teach. A fire set low and steady beneath the earth could outlast any blizzard. When the fire burned, cool air was drawn in through the lower vent, feeding oxygen directly beneath the flames. Hot air escaped through the top vent. The pressure difference created a natural draft that kept the smoke clean and the heat steady. Modern tests by Frontier Heritage Labs have shown that such designs can maintain temperatures above freezing for over 72 hours with a single small fire. To a mountain man, that wasn't just convenience, that was salvation. It meant his gunpowder stayed dry. His pelts didn't rot. His fingers didn't freeze when he needed to strike flint or fletch an arrow. The native lodges had pioneered the method centuries earlier, but the mountain men added a twist: stone, clay, and sometimes even cast-iron fragments scavenged from old wagons. Where the Cherokee Aussie had breathed gently, the trappers built tighter and hotter, turning survival into craft. Among the men who refined this art, William Sublette was the most methodical. A businessman first, a trapper second, he treated the frontier like a laboratory. His journals, now preserved in the Missouri Historical Society archives, describe in detail how he experimented with layered chimneys. One pipe of clay, one of stone, the stone to keep its heat longer, the clay to draw air the softer way. In 1832, when Sublette built Fort William near the Platte, he ordered the bunkhouses to be dug half into the earth, with fire pits vented below the floor. Visiting traders later wrote that even at 30 below zero, the fort's chambers were so temperate a man could write without gloves. Sublette had done what few others attempted. He merged frontier tradition with native wisdom and basic engineering. It wasn't just a lodge anymore, it was a system. There was a saying among the trappers, "Fire's a good friend till it starts talking back." They meant that you had to listen to it. A fire too bright meant your draft was wrong. A fire that smoked meant your vent was clogged. A fire that whistled meant wind had found a crack. To a mountain man, those sounds were like reading a compass. In the journals of Osborne Russell, one of the last free trappers of the Rockies, he recalls watching a Blackfoot elder build a lodge in 3 hours flat. The man piled clay, sticks, and hide with such rhythm that the very flames seemed to bow before his hand. Russell later wrote, "The Indian makes his fire live with him. We whites make it work for us." That is why his house outlasts his guests. It was not poetry, it was truth. The more the mountain. Men copied native design, the less they fought the cold. By the 1,850 the dugout lodge style had spread from the Rockies into the plains. Pioneers crossing the Oregon Trail took notes from old trappers who showed them how to bank their wagons with earth, how to bury their stoves half below ground, how to use sod as insulation. When the Homestead Act came decades later, many settlers built soddy, small, low-roofed homes that were direct descendants of those frontier earth lodges. They didn't know it, but they were building with centuries of inherited knowledge. The Cherokee, the Crow, the Mountain Men, all their lessons lived in those walls. Today, historians like Dr. Ellen Martins of the University of Wyoming call this lineage frontier vernacular architecture. In plain terms, it means the land itself taught the builders. Each region produced its own signature lodge, the dugout cabins of the Rockies, the earth houses of the Dakotas, the bank barns of the Appalachians. Different names, same bones. There's a story from the last winter of Jedediah Strong's trapping days, 1847, when he spent 3 weeks alone in the Wind River Range after losing his horse and gear. He survived with only a flint, a blanket, and the memory of what the Shoshone had once shown him. He dug into a drifted hillside, used frozen sod for bricks, and set a small fire beneath a hole lined with elk hide. He wrote later in his weather-beaten notebook, "It was not the fire that saved me, but the dirt that held it." That phrase became something of a legend among trappers. It captured the essence of frontier ingenuity, the understanding that power and gentleness could coexist in one small hearth. To this day, in survival manuals and bushcraft schools across the American West, that method remains known as the Mountain Man Fire Pit, a living legacy of Cherokee craft and frontier persistence. When the fur trade finally died and the old trappers scattered to farms, forts, and railroads, their lodges vanished into the soil. But every so often, archaeologists uncover the round scars of those fire pits, black circles of ash sealed beneath centuries of silt. In Montana, at a site near Fort Union, one such pit was found still containing charred willow and red clay fused by heat. Radiocarbon dating placed it at 1,838 a time, when Bridger himself may have been riding nearby. What the scientists found matched the descriptions in Bridger's and Sublette's journals perfectly. The structure was real. The method worked. It wasn't myth, it was mountain science, written in smoke and stone. So much of frontier legend burns bright and disappears. But this quiet mastery of earth and flame endures. Modern wilderness engineers still build like the mountain men, low, insulated, hidden from wind. Campers still trench their fires the way Bridger taught. Architects still speak of thermal mass, not realizing they're echoing a Cherokee word that once meant the warm heart of the mountain. The line between myth and method fades when the snow falls and a man sits by a low-burning fire, feeling the breath of the earth beneath him. Because in the end, that's what the mountain men learned, what the Cherokee already knew, that the surest shelter is not above the ground, but of it. And when a fire hums softly inside an earthen wall, the mountain listens. By the time the railroads began creeping westward in the 1,850, most of the old trappers had traded their rifles for plows. Their beaver traps lay rusting in barns, their buckskins replaced by coarse homespun. But though the age of fur and flint was ending, The knowledge the mountain men carried, the lessons of shelter, endurance, and harmony with the land had only just begun to spread. What the settlers called frontier architecture was not born in drawing rooms or universities. It was born in frost and silence, where men learned the hard way that a roof was only as good as the mountain beneath it. When Jim Bridger settled near present-day Bozeman, Montana, he was already a legend, one-eyed, grizzled, and weathered by 1,000 storms. He'd seen more of the West than any mapmaker alive. But when new settlers arrived from Missouri and Kentucky, hauling clapboard wagons and fancy blueprints, he just laughed. "You can't build a Missouri house in the Rockies," he told them. "The mountain'll tear it apart." They didn't believe him, not at first. That winter, the settlers' cabins cracked under the weight of snow. Roofs caved in, chimneys froze solid, and the wind howled through every joint. Yet Bridger's low, sod-roofed lodge, half dug into the hillside and shaped like a sleeping buffalo, stayed warm as a hearth. The newcomers came knocking by spring, humbled and half-starved. Bridger opened the door, handed them shovels, and said, "You want to live out here, you best? Learn to listen to the ground." Thus began one of the strangest apprenticeships in American history, the era when the last of the mountain men became the teachers of civilization. The first lesson was simple: build with what the land gives you. The Cherokee, the Shoshone, and the Mandan had practiced this truth for centuries. So had the mountain men, who borrowed freely from native design. When the settlers finally listened, they learned to read the soil the same way a trapper reads a trail. Men like Bridger and Kit Carson showed them how to thatch with grass, how to layer sod for insulation, and how to vent a hearth so smoke rose slow and clean. One young carpenter, Ephraim Boone, wrote in his journal after watching Bridger build a chimney of woven willow coated in clay, "It went against all my reason, yet it drew better than any brickwork I'd laid in Kentucky." The old man smiled and said, "The air don't care for brick, it cares for breath." By adapting these principles, settlers began constructing homes that didn't just survive the mountains, they belonged to them. To the mountain men, every tool was sacred. They spoke of an axe the way a preacher might speak of a Bible, but they knew the spade was just as holy, for the earth itself was half the structure. A proper frontier house was not perched upon the land, it was sunk into it. The settlers learned to bank their cabins with dirt, to let the hillside bear the weight of their walls. It was as if the mountain had become both builder and protector. Archaeological surveys today at Fort Hall and South Pass show layers of compacted soil packed against old timber walls, the same method described in the journals of Charles Larpenteur, who wrote, "We buried our homes halfway in the ground, as the crows do their lodges, and found the winter kinder for it." This design, called earth banking, reduced wind exposure and held in warmth. It also meant a man could build with half the timber of a normal cabin, a godsend in the sparse alpine forests. The settlers soon realized they weren't merely imitating Indians or trappers, they were inheriting a science. The spread of this architectural wisdom followed the great migration routes, the Oregon Trail, the Santa Fe Trail, and the Bozeman Road. Each became a moving classroom. Mountain men, often hired as guides, found themselves teaching more than navigation. They showed pioneers how to pitch canvas against the wind, how to trench a fire pit, and how to thatch a wagon into a shelter when storms came howling across the plains. In 1846, when the Donner Party set out for California, they ignored such advice. Their cabins, built in haste and arrogance, lacked proper venting or banking. When the snow buried them, their fires choked for air. The lesson came too late. Survivors later described how the mountain silence seemed alive, a reminder that ignorance is not forgiven easily in the high country. Those who lived took note. In later years, emigrants stopped to study every fort and lodge along the way, sketching designs passed down from trappers who'd learned them from tribes long before. One of those sketches, now preserved in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal, shows a hybrid structure, a settler's gable roof atop a Cherokee-style earthen base. The caption reads simply, "Taught by Bridger, built by Boone, blessed by the snow." By the 1872, architects and scholars from the East began to take notice of these strange, sturdy frontier homes. the Smithsonian Institution dispatched surveyors to document the vernacular architecture of the West. What they found astounded them. Many homesteads from the Dakotas to Colorado shared common features: low profiles, vented hearths, and walls of mixed clay and log. These were not primitive huts, they were thermal masterpieces designed intuitively for efficiency. One surveyor, Dr. Henry Whipple, wrote in his 1873 report, "The builders of these so-called soddies possess a wisdom not taught in our academies. They have rediscovered a natural law that warmth is not the gift of fire alone, but of form."